Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be part of this symposium, and I thank Carol very much for the invitation. My role is to look back, and there's a health warning at the beginning because there's a huge amount of material that I would need to cover in a detailed presentation, and I can only discuss a very small fraction of that. This is my three-part agenda. Now, the origins of social science interest in poverty and old age go back a very long way. In fact, the earliest positivist approaches to social science in the UK were actually focused on this topic. Charles Booth, and the Royal Commission on the Aged Poor in 1895 found that 1/3 of older people depended on poor relief to prevent absolute destitution. If we leap forward to the BSG era, 80 years after Booth, Townsend adopted a relative definition of poverty and pointed to the persistent failure to understand the problem. In other words, he was saying it's not just a matter of governments not allocating sufficient resources to old age, but it's a failure to understand why people are poor in old age. And Townsend found 2/3 of single pensioners and 1/2 of married ones were living in poverty or on the margins of poverty in the late 1960s. Now, this long view slide shows that despite the welfare state, in the 1950s and 1960s, there was still a heavy preponderance of poverty in old age. And older people were the largest group in poverty up to the 1990s. And as you can see from the graph, there are big fluctuations and then a decline, especially in the last 20 years. But nonetheless, poverty remains a significant problem for a minority of older people. And as many researchers have shown, poverty in old age is a very specific experience. In particular, it's likely to be a permanent experience with none of the what are called churning fluctuations that younger adults experience. Now, international comparisons reveal that poverty in old age in the UK is relatively high compared with other Western European countries, not as high, of course, as some of the Eastern European countries. And, of course, globally, poverty remains a major problem. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, up to 80% of older people live in deep poverty. So, as Townsend indicated, an enduring question for social gerontology is why is poverty so persistent in old age? And this slide summarizes the main factors. And because of lack of time, I'm going to summarize it. And I would say the causes do not point primarily to individual behavior, but rather the socio-political circumstances within which people age, coupled with the particular social policy regime within which people age. And that points back to the international comparisons, including the European comparisons, which demonstrate a very wide range of socio-political responses to the risk of poverty in old age. Now, thinking about our contribution of social gerontologists, the legacy we inherited was largely a homogenized one. Poverty and inequality were simply not part of the mainstream of social gerontology. And the first reaction against that functionalist account of later life was the political economy of aging perspective. And political economy was new in two respects. First of all, it described a different, multifaceted reality to the conventional wisdom in gerontology, which, as I say, was a more homogenized perspective. And secondly, political economy tried to explain the persistence of poverty and inequality in later life. The initial focus of political economy was on occupational class. But the second reaction against homogenization came from feminist scholars who pointed to the gendered nature of distribution. And thirdly, at the same time, a few pioneers in gerontology were highlighting from a political economy perspective the hugely unequal aging experienced by Black, Asian, and minoritized ethnic communities. My co-presenter, James, produced these stark findings as part of the Growing Older program in the early 2000s. And you can see they show wide inequalities between different ethnic minority groups in both employment and at occupational class. Then, under European influence, the UK, social gerontology in the UK, began to investigate not just poverty, but social exclusion as a feature of later life. And that enlarged the possibilities beyond a discussion of poverty to one concerned with a broader range of factors that exclude people from different forms of participation. Now, those different strands were brought together into critical gerontology, political economy, humanistic and biographical gerontology, with an underlying linking concern about social justice, about human rights, and empowerment. The cultural turn contributed to this mix with a focus on difference as well as inequality. And again, thanks to the European Union, the long neglected strand of comparative research in social gerontology was revived, and much of that comparative work has focused on social exclusion and inequality. And then the final contribution has brought inequality to the fore, along with the life course and especially cumulative advantage and disadvantage, and most recently, intersectionality. So, as I hand over to James, these are the important elements for future research based on that previous experience in social gerontology. First of all, I think homogeneity has been buried and inequality is mainstream. Secondly, we now have a sophisticated understanding of the operation of agency within constraints. Those constraints rest on unequal distributions of power. So the roles of patriarchy and racism come to the fore as modes of oppression and modes of control. Thirdly, we have a critical perspective, which is mainstream, that fusion of political economy, humanistic and moral economy perspectives. Fourthly, the life course is now central to any understanding of unequal aging. Fifthly, most recently, we've begun to focus on intersections of inequality, even though tracking down those intersections and how they relate to each other is a huge and complex task for gerontology. And then finally, I'd say that we still see the continuing importance of social justice as a critical lens within which to examine later life and its inequalities. Thank you very much.